The speech that stopped the room. The grand hall was filled with veterans, families, community leaders, and reporters. The event was meant to honor acts of courage and sacrifice. Among the guests was businessman and national leader Richard Turner, a man known for confidence, determination, and strong leadership. Richard had attended hundreds of ceremonies before. Most followed the same pattern: speeches, applause, photographs, and handshakes. But this event would be different. As the lights dimmed, the host announced the next speaker. Please welcome Mrs. Helen Carter, mother of Marine Sergeant Daniel Carter. The audience stood and applauded respectfully. Helen slowly walked toward the podium. Carrying a small framed photograph, her hands shook slightly. She looked at the crowd and smiled. Sadly, my son always hated being the center of attention, she began. A gentle laugh spread across the room. He would probably tell me to sit down right now. The audience laughed again, then her smile faded. But I promised him that one day I would tell his story. The room became silent. Helen described Daniel's childhood. He loved helping neighbors, fixing bicycles for children, and volunteering at local shelters. He believed every person mattered, she said. Richard listened carefully. Story felt different from the usual speeches he heard. Then, Helen revealed something unexpected. 3 years before his final mission, Daniel secretly paid the rent for a struggling family for nearly 8 months. The audience gasped softly. No one knew, she continued. We only discovered it after his passing. Richard lowered his eyes. He wasn't expecting that, but Helen wasn't finished. She reached into her purse and unfolded an old letter. This letter was written 2 weeks before Daniel died. The room froze. Helen's voice trembled. I have never shared its contents publicly. People leaned forward in their seats. Even Richard sat completely still. Then she unfolded the paper and began to read. First sentence left the entire room speechless. The letter no one was supposed to read. The room was so quiet that people could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Helen Carter unfolded the yellowed letter carefully. Her fingers trembled. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she looked toward the audience and took a deep breath. This is what Daniel wrote. She began reading. Mom, if you're reading this, it means life didn't go the way we hoped. Please don't spend your days being sad. I have lived a life filled with purpose, and that's more than many people ever get. But there is something I've never told anyone. Murmur moved through the crowd. Richard Turner sat forward in his chair. Helen paused. Tears filled her eyes. Then she continued. 5 years ago, I met a little girl named Sophie at a children's hospital. The audience listened carefully. She was battling a serious illness. Her family couldn't afford all the treatments she needed. I promised myself I would help. Helen's voice cracked. For years, I quietly sent money to support her family. People exchanged surprised looks no one had known. This, not even Daniel's closest friends. Richard felt a lump forming in his throat. He looked down at the photograph of Daniel displayed on the giant screen behind the stage. The young Marine smiled confidently from the picture. Yet no one had known about the lives he had quietly changed. Helen continued reading. I never wanted recognition. I only wanted Sophie to have a chance. Many people in the audience wiped tears from their eyes, but then came another revelation, a much bigger one. Helen looked at the next paragraph and hesitated. She seemed unsure whether to continue. The audience waited. Finally, she spoke. There's one more thing. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Daniel wrote that Sophie doesn't know who helped. Her gasps echoed through the hall. The donations had always been anonymous. The family never knew where the support came from. 4 years they had believed a stranger was helping them. No one realized it was Daniel. Richard slowly shook his head. What kind of person does that? He whispered to the man sitting beside him. The man replied quietly. The kind we don't hear about enough. The crowd applauded softly. Helen folded part of the letter. Everyone assumed the emotional moment was ending. They were wrong, because hidden inside the envelope was another piece of paper. A second note. Helen stared at it, her face suddenly changed. Confusion, shock, even fear. The audience noticed. Immediately, the room became silent again. Richard narrowed his eyes. Something wasn't right. "Mrs. Carter?" the host asked gently. Helen looked up. "I've never seen this before." The audience froze. The host stepped closer. "What do you mean?" Helen held up the small folded note. "This wasn't in the envelope when I last read the letter." People began whispering. Richard stood from his seat, and the tension inside the hall became almost unbearable. Carefully, Helen unfolded the paper. A single handwritten sentence appeared. Her eyes widened. For several seconds she couldn't speak. The audience waited anxiously. Then, she finally read it aloud. "If Sophie is ever found, tell her to visit the old oak tree by Lake Harrison." Silence. Complete silence. No one understood. What did it mean? Who wrote it? When was it placed there? And why had Daniel never mentioned it before? Even Helen looked confused. "I don't know anything about an oak tree," she said. The host looked equally puzzled. Richard's heart raced. For some reason, the message felt important. Very important. Almost like a final mission Daniel had left unfinished. After the ceremony ended, reporters rushed toward Helen with questions, but she had no answers. Outside the building, evening rain began falling. Richard stood beneath the entrance canopy watching people leave, yet he couldn't stop thinking about that mysterious note. The old oak tree, Lake Harrison, Sophie. Daniels. Secret. Something connected all of them, and somehow, Richard knew the story wasn't over. A black SUV pulled up beside him. His assistant opened the door. "Ready to go home, sir?" Richard looked back at the building, then at the photograph of Daniel displayed near the entrance. "No," he said quietly. His assistant looked confused. "No," Richard shook his head. "Tomorrow morning we're going to Lake Harrison." The assistant blinked. "Why?" Richard stared into the rain. "Because Daniel wanted someone to find something." The assistant remained silent. Richard opened the SUV door. "And I think we're about to discover what it is." Far away, hidden beside the shoreline of Lake Harrison, an ancient oak tree stood alone in the darkness. Beneath its roots lay a secret untouched for years, a secret that would change multiple lives forever, and nobody, not Helen, not Sophie, not even Richard, was prepared for what they were about to find. The secret beneath the oak tree. The next morning, dark clouds hung over Lake Harrison. A cold breeze swept across the water. Richard Turner stood beside his black SUV, staring at the enormous oak tree that stretched its branches toward the gray sky. "This is it?" his assistant asked. Richard nodded. "It has to be." The tree looked ordinary, old, weathered, silent. Nothing about it suggested it held a secret, yet Daniel Carter's final note had pointed directly here. Richard walked slowly around the trunk. The ground beneath was covered in fallen leaves. Birds chirped softly overhead for several minutes. They found nothing, his assistant sighed. "Maybe it's symbolic." "Maybe," Richard replied, but something told him. Otherwise, Daniel didn't seem like the kind of man who left meaningless clues. Then Richard noticed something unusual. Near one of the roots was a small metal plate partially buried beneath dirt. He knelt down. "What is that?" Using a stick, he cleared away the soil. A tiny engraving appeared. D.C. Daniel. Carter's initials. Richard's heart skipped. "This is it." The assistant stared in disbelief. Together, they carefully removed more dirt. A few moments later, they uncovered a rusted metal box. Neither man spoke. The air suddenly felt heavier or serious. Richard slowly lifted the box. It was locked, but years of weather had weakened it. The latch broke easily. Inside were dozens of envelopes, photographs, letters, and one leather journal. Richard opened the first envelope. His eyes widened. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman. "To whoever helped my family, thank you for paying my husband's medical bills when we had nowhere else to turn." Another envelope, another letter, another family, another. Life changed, one after another. Dozens of stories, dozens of people, every single one helped anonymously. The realization hit Richard like a wave. Daniel hadn't only helped Sophie. He had quietly helped many families, many struggling strangers. for years, without ever telling anyone. His assistant looked stunned. How is this possible? Richard shook his head. I don't know. Then he opened the leather journal. The first page contained a sentence written in Daniel's handwriting. If you're reading this, it means someone finally found the tree. Richard felt chills. He continued reading. People often think heroes wear uniforms, run businesses, or hold important titles. Sometimes they do, but the greatest heroes are ordinary people who help when nobody is watching. The words struck deeply. Richard sat silently beneath the tree. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about success or money or achievements. He was thinking about impact, about kindness, about legacy. Then another shocking discovery appeared tucked between two journal pages was a recent photograph, much newer than the others. Richard examined it carefully. Teenage girl stood smiling beside a hospital building. Written on the back were two words, Sophie Carter. Not Sophie Williams, not Sophie Anderson. Sophie Carter. Richard frowned. That didn't make sense. The girl Daniel had helped shared his last name. His assistant looked confused. What if she's related to him? Richard immediately turned another page. And there it was. The hidden secret Daniel had never told anyone. A secret powerful enough to change everything. The journal explained that years earlier, Daniel had discovered he had a younger half-sister. Her name was Sophie. She had grown up in another state. Because of family circumstances, they had never met. When Daniel learned she was seriously ill, he secretly began helping her, but he never revealed his identity. He wanted her to succeed on her own. He wanted her to feel supported, not indebted. Richard sat speechless. The story suddenly became far more personal. Daniel hadn't simply helped a stranger. He had protected family from the shadows, without asking for recognition, without expecting anything in return. His assistant wiped his eyes. She doesn't know? Richard slowly shook his head. No, at that moment, his phone rang. It was Helen Carter. Richard answered immediately. Helen. Richard, she said. Her voice sounded emotional. I found something. What? An old family record. Richard stood frozen. His heart pounded. What did you find? Helen took a deep breath. Daniel wasn't the only child. Richard closed his eyes. The journal had been right. The secret was real. But before he could explain what they had discovered, Helen spoke again. There is something else. Her voice trembled. What is it? Richard asked. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she whispered, I think Sophie is coming to the town tomorrow. Richard's eyes widened. What? I received a message this morning. The world seemed to stop after all these years, after all the hidden letters, after all the anonymous sacrifices. The girl Daniel had secretly protected might finally learn the truth. But Richard had no idea how she would react. Would she be grateful? Angry? Heartbroken? Or would discovering the truth change her life forever? As the wind shook the branches above them, Richard looked down at Daniel's journal one more time. A final folded page slipped out. He unfolded it carefully. His face instantly turned pale, because written across the page was a final message. If Sophie ever learns who I am, there is one last thing she must know. The rest of the page was missing, torn away, gone. And somewhere out there, the missing piece still existed. The missing page, the torn page changed everything. Richard Turner stared at the journal in disbelief. The final sentence Daniel Carter had written was incomplete. If Sophie ever learns who I am, there is one last thing she must know. And then nothing. The remainder of the page had been ripped away. Richard turned the journal upside down, hoping the missing piece had somehow fallen. Inside, nothing, only empty pages, remained. His assistant looked over his shoulder. Maybe someone removed it. Richard nodded slowly. Or maybe Daniel hid it somewhere else. The possibility sent chills down his spine. What could be important enough to hide even from his own family? The answer had to be connected to Sophie. And now Sophie was coming to town. The timing felt impossible, almost as if fate had arranged it. That evening, Helen Carter sat quietly in her living room. Old family photographs covered the coffee table. For the first time in years, she was looking at memories she had avoided. A knock came at the door. Richard had arrived. When Helen welcomed him inside, he immediately showed her the journal. As she turned each page, tears rolled down her cheeks. "That's Daniel," she whispered. "Always helping people." Then, Richard showed her the photograph of Sophie. Helen covered her mouth. "My goodness, you've never seen her before?" Helen shook her head. "Only once. Many years ago." The room fell silent. Then Richard revealed the biggest discovery. The journal confirms Daniel knew she was his half-sister. Helen's eyes filled with tears. "He never told me. He wanted to protect her." Helen looked toward the window. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. For several moments neither spoke. Then Helen suddenly remembered something. Her eyes widened. "Wait." Richard looked up. "What?" "There was a box." "What box?" Helen stood quickly. "When Daniel was younger, he kept important things inside a wooden box." Richard felt his pulse quicken. "Do you still have it?" "I think so." They hurried upstairs. The attic was dusty and dimly lit. Old furniture filled the space. Family memories sat untouched for years. After 20 minutes of searching, Helen found it. A small wooden box hidden behind several storage containers. Her hands trembled as she opened. Inside were childhood photographs, baseball cards, old letters, and one sealed envelope. The envelope had a single name written on it. For Sophie. Richard and Helen exchanged stunned looks. Neither spoke. Slowly, Helen opened it. Inside was another handwritten letter from Daniel. The date shocked them. It had been written only days before his final mission. Helen began reading aloud. "Dear Sophie, if you're reading this, it means someone finally found the truth." Both of them froze. The letter continued. "I wanted to tell you everything myself one day, but life doesn't always give us that chance." Helen struggled to continue. Her voice broke repeatedly. Richard listened carefully. Then came another emotional revelation. "I never told you who I was because I wanted you to build your future without feeling obligated to me." Tears rolled down Helen's face, but the most powerful words were still ahead. "You were never alone, Sophie. Even when you thought you were." The room became silent. Neither could speak. Then they reached the final paragraph, and suddenly everything changed. "There is one more secret that nobody knows." Richard immediately sat upright. The secret, the final missing piece, the answer they had been searching for. Helen continued, reading. 5 years ago, I created a scholarship fund using my savings and donations from friends." Richard's eyes widened. "A scholarship fund?" Daniel had never mentioned it. Helen kept reading. "The fund was designed to help children who lost parents while serving their communities." Richard couldn't believe it. Even after his death, Daniel had planned to keep helping others, but there was more. Much more. The final lines revealed something nobody expected. "The scholarship fund belongs to Sophie." Helen stopped reading. "What?" Richard looked equally shocked. The letter continued. "One day she will decide who receives it. She will continue helping people long after I'm gone." Helen sat down slowly. The responsibility Daniel had left behind was enormous. But then Richard noticed something unusual. There was another folded document attached to the letter. A legal document, an official trust agreement, signed witness. Valid. The scholarship fund was real, and it contained far more money than either of them imagined. Richard flipped to the final page. His eyes widened. Then he looked at Helen. She immediately knew something was wrong. "What is it?" Richard swallowed hard. "Helen, what?" "The fund isn't worth thousands." Helen's face turned pale. "Then how much?" Richard slowly turned the page toward her. Her hands began shaking. "Because the amount written there was enough to change hundreds of lives, possibly thousands." Daniel had somehow built something far larger than anyone knew, and tomorrow, Sophie would arrive. Tomorrow, she would learn Daniel was her brother. He had protected her for years. He had secretly changed countless lives, and he had left her the responsibility of continuing his mission. But neither Richard nor Helen knew one crucial fact. Sophie herself had been hiding a secret. Secret she planned to reveal when she arrived. secret that could change the entire story. As thunder echoed outside the house, Richard stared at the window. For the first time, he felt nervous because tomorrow wasn't just about answers. Tomorrow would uncover truths no one was prepared for. And somewhere among those truths was a final surprise. Daniel had never revealed the legacy of a hero. The next morning arrived with clear skies. For the first time in days, sunlight shined over the small town, but inside the Carter home, emotions were running high. Today was the day. After years of secrets, unanswered questions, and hidden sacrifices, Sophie was finally arriving. Helen Carter stood near the front window, her hands trembled. Richard Turner sat quietly nearby, neither spoke much. Both were thinking about the same thing. How do you tell someone that the brother she never knew had spent years protecting her from the shadows? A car finally pulled into the driveway. The moment had arrived. Helen's heart pounded. The front door opened. Young woman stepped inside. She looked nervous, excited, confused, and perhaps a little afraid. "Sophie?" Helen asked softly. The young woman nodded. For a moment, neither moved. Then Helen wrapped her arms around her. Both women began crying. Years of separation disappeared in seconds. Richard quietly looked away, giving them privacy. After a few minutes, everyone gathered in the living room. The old photographs, the journal, the letters, the trust documents, everything sat on the table. Sophie stared at them. "I still don't understand," she admitted. Helen gently placed Daniel's photograph in front of her. The room became silent. Then Helen told her everything: the hidden donations, the anonymous support, the hospital bills, the scholarship fund, the oak tree, the journal, the truth. Daniel Carter had been her brother, the person who had quietly helped her through the hardest years of her life, without ever asking for credit, without ever revealing his identity, without ever expecting anything in return. The time Helen finished speaking, Sophie was crying uncontrollably. She picked up the photograph. Her hands shook. "He knew about me?" Helen nodded. "Yes, for all those years?" "Yes," Sophie's voice cracked. "And he never stopped helping?" Helen could barely answer. "No, he never stopped." The room fell silent. Then Sophie noticed the final letter, the one found inside the wooden box. She carefully opened it. Everyone watched. Her eyes moved across the page, slowly, quietly. Then tears rolled down her face. But suddenly, something unexpected happened. She smiled. Richard looked surprised. Helen looked confused. Sophie wiped her tears. "I have something to tell you." The room became still. "What is it?" Richard asked. Sophie reached into her purse. Then she removed several folders. She placed them on the table. "What are those?" Helen asked. Sophie looked at Daniel's photograph. Then she smiled through her tears. "My secret." Richard opened one of the folders. His eyes widened. Inside were plans, applications, financial reports, volunteer records, hundreds of pages. "What is all this?" he asked. Sophie took a deep breath. 3 years ago, I started a small charity." Helen blinked. "A charity?" Sophie nodded. "It helps children whose families are facing medical emergencies." Richard looked stunned. She continued, "I never had much money, but I wanted to help others the way someone helped me." Neither Helen nor Richard could speak. Then came the final revelation, the one nobody expected. Sophie smiled sadly. "Every year, I named the charity after a person I never knew." Richard's heart raced. What was the name? Sophie looked at Daniel's photograph. Then she answered, "The Carter Hope Foundation." Helen burst into tears. Richard lowered his head. For several moments, nobody spoke. The coincidence seemed impossible. Without knowing the truth, Sophie had already been continuing Daniel's mission for years. Helping families, supporting children, changing lives, just like her brother. The room filled with emotion, but there was still one final surprise. Richard picked up the trust documents. The scholarship fund Daniel had created was enormous, large, enough to help thousands of families. He looked at Sophie. "What?" do you want to do with it?" Everyone waited. Sophie looked out the window. Sunlight streamed across the room. Then she looked back at Daniel's photograph and smiled. The same thing Daniel would have done. "What is that?" Richard asked. She wiped away tears. "Help as many people as possible." A smile spread across Helen's face. Richard nodded. At that moment, something incredible happened. The story was no longer about loss. It was about legacy. Daniel's kindness had survived. His compassion had survived. His mission had survived, and now it would continue for generations. Months later, the Carter Hope Foundation and Daniel's Scholarship Fund officially joined together. Children received medical assistance. Students earned scholarships. Families found hope during difficult times. Lives changed, not because of fame, not because of recognition, but because one young Marine believed that helping others mattered, and because one sister chose to continue that mission. Years later, a small plaque was placed beneath the old oak tree at Lake Harrison. It contained a simple message. The greatest legacy is not what we leave behind, is the lives we change while we are here. Visitors stopped to read those words every day. Many never knew the full story, but that was okay, because Daniel never wanted attention. He only wanted to make a difference, and in the end, he did something even greater. He inspired others to do the same. As the sun set over Lake Harrison, the oak tree stood quietly beside the water. Its branches moved gently in the wind, watching over a legacy built on kindness, a legacy that would never be forgotten.